Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We thought it would be a good idea to give you the opportunity to hear about what we've been doing down in Canberra, because we are away from everyone for a couple of weeks and we're so busy down there and there's so much going on that we wanted to be able to share it with you. So thank you so much for joining. It's great to have you here. I wish I could see your faces. I'd also thank you, Anyo, for that introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all meeting on today, and just thank them for caring for this country for since time immemorial, for looking after our coastlands, our country and our waterways. And just to say as well that this year is a really exciting year, and that's one thing I'll get onto a bit later, is we have the opportunity to enshrine that Indigenous voice into our Constitution. I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to unite our nation and to start that healing process and to also learn from that age-old wisdom. So it's an exciting year, lots going on. And I'll duck into it. I'm actually happy if there's something that I'm talking about, because we will cover a lot. There's a lot that goes on down in Canberra, and I'll also get Georgia to jump in sometimes just to, fill in any gaps that I have. But if you do have a question on what I'm talking about, I'm very happy for Anyo to send that my way as well. Thanks, Anyo. That's all good. But I wanted to say that we've been very busy all summer as well. We did a lot of planning, a lot of strategic planning, because one thing we realised is there are a lot of issues to cover off, and if we try and cover everything, we're not going to be really effective. So we need to focus on what are the top issues for this electorate. So one of the things we did do, and you'll soon receive something in your letterboxes, is we did another survey of the entire electorate, just to make sure that we were on target with what we felt were the top priorities for this community. And very glad to say that we think we're on target. It was very similar to what we found out when we did the Voices kitchen table conversations and the reports that have come through that as well. So very much we have 6 pillars that we would like to focus on that are really important to this community, and they are climate change, integrity, economic and the economy and small business, health is another big one, and then we've sort of clumped together a whole range of things and we've called it social cultural issues, and that can be anything from, I've been asked to be a spokesperson for the music industry. I think following on from that fabulous concert we had, thank you Anyo and others who organised it. I actually had nothing to do with it, but so I've been asked to be a spokesperson for the music industry, but also through to everything that will encompass also the voice, things like raise the age, refugee and immigration. It just goes on and on, the status of what's happening in Iran and Afghani women and Ukraine. So there's lots there. And also our 6th pillar is what's happening in the local community. So making sure that if there's big issues that are really important to our local community, even though they might not be federal issues, that we are supporting the community regardless. And they are things like the Northern Beaches Hospital. We had a meeting with them recently. The Wakehurst Parkway and roads infrastructure, of course, and things like mental health as well. And the other one is development in the area, and particularly just looking at, because it's becoming a bit critical, is the development at Lizard Rock at Oxford Falls. We've been looking at that as well and meeting with lots of people. So that's just to give you a bit of background on our thinking. We want to make sure that we are effective in what we do over these next 2 years, and to be effective we need to remain focused. And there's so many different pillars in amongst all those 6 pillars, is that we've been, and I'd like to talk to you about how we've been collaborating with the other independents as well, because generally our communities are very similar, have very similar values. We each have certain interests and certain passions, and so it's just working together to make sure that we're not working at cross purposes or doing the same work, or who we can work with who's got a similar interest. And so it's been really wonderful to collaborate with the other independents, and particularly and very excited that what we've been working really hard on recently is the Ending Jobs for Mates bill, we've been working with the Centre for Public Integrity, who have also been collaborating with the Grattan Institute and the Australia Institute and Transparency International Australia and other groups as well. I probably missed a couple, Georgia. But we have finalised the Ending Jobs for Mates Bill, which is called Quality and Transparent Public Appointments 2023, and we'll be introducing that. It's been accepted to be introduced on the Monday of the first sitting week back on the 6th of March. And one thing we were thinking is we would love, and actually this was a suggestion, that the bill, it's a private member's bill. It's going to be seconded by Helen Haynes because she's just got such a wonderful history with integrity, and she just, with the whole Integrity Commission and things like that. So she was delighted to be able to second it. And one of the suggestions she had was, we could perhaps invite a busload of people to come down. So if anyone out there is interested in coming down, I'll be introducing that on the Monday, 6th of March, and there can be some more information about that as well. But we'd love to see you down there. We'll have a morning tea or something afterwards, but just a bit of a celebration. So that's that work. We also last Parliament had a briefing where we briefed the entire crossbench, both in the House of Reps and the Senate. We had everyone, Jackie Lambie and Tammy Tyrrell, and we had even Pauline Hanson's representatives coming to listen about it. It's an issue which is very important to nearly everyone in the government, sorry, in Parliament. And I think actually, Georgia, we had a bit of a win, didn't we? Because the week before we went back to Parliament, we briefed the Attorney General on the bill, on the Ending Jobs for Mates bill, and we were surprised that 5 days later the government announced that they were having an inquiry called No More Jobs for Mates, looking into board appointments. So look, we take that as a win, because really what this is all about is just driving that national conversation and getting this spotlight on integrity and ensuring that actually we are moving towards, you know, greater transparency, greater accountability in our democratic and political system. So we take that as a win. We're not satisfied with what they're doing at all, but because it's only quite narrow, the inquiry is quite narrow. It is only looking at board appointments, Commonwealth board appointments, whereas what we are looking at is far more broad and encompasses even just the different institutions, including things like the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and even something when we do introduce it, there'll also be a Public Appointments Commissioner. So looking at all those different types of things. I feel like I'm talking a lot, Georgia. I'll throw to you sometimes. Georgia, I will throw to you. Would you like to explain to everyone what actually that Ending Jobs for Mates bill is all about? That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. It's a really comprehensive bill, actually. As Sophie mentioned, it is the first private members bill that she's going to introduce on behalf of the people of Mackellar, which is really exciting, and why we thought it would be lovely to give people the opportunity to come and see it introduced. It sets up a mechanism for major Commonwealth public appointments, and it places a variety of requirements onto those appointments. Sophie's already mentioned the Public Appointments Commissioner. That person kind of sits at the top of the framework and will oversee in one way or another all of the public appointments that are made. Underneath that, there's something called an independent selection panel, which every government department will have, so that when one of these major appointments is available for people to apply to, the panel gets together. It will be chaired by the Public Appointments Commissioner, and they have a variety of things they have to go through. They have to have clear criteria for the job. They have to advertise the job. They have to have a mind to the quality of the candidates as well as the diversity of the public service in making their decisions. And then that panel basically comes up with a shortlist of at least 3 people that they put to the minister, and the minister then gets to decide from the shortlist and cannot decide on anyone other than who's on the shortlist. So we think it strikes a really good balance between making sure that there is integrity in public appointments, making sure there's transparency in those appointments, and really just fixing the problem that we have, which is cronyism. in some really important government positions. So that's exciting, and it's applicable in so many different ways. We'll be talking about it in a lot of ways, even after we introduce the bill.
Yep, great. Yeah, and as we saw, there's a big problem around appointments. So the government did have to abolish the Administrative Appeals Tribunal because it was just so stacked with politically friendly appointments. It was ridiculous. And that means that you can't trust the decisions that are coming out of those democratic institutions. And another one that we have a concern about is the Climate Change Authority, where the people who were appointed by Angus Taylor are still, on that, leading that authority as well. So there's a lot to look at. It is a big issue, and I've just seen a little note from Anyo that there's a lot of questions about the safeguard mechanism, so we can move on to that. That's sort of looking forward, but it is a huge issue, so very happy to talk about that for a little bit as well. That's something that will be debated in March, and we've actually, Georgia and I have been having quite a few meetings about safeguard mechanism and the best way to approach it to make sure we improve it. At the moment, it's not nearly strong enough. It is not going to get us to 43%, even that sort of moderate target. It won't reach that because it does not stop companies from polluting. It just allows them to 100% offset their pollution. So, and in actual fact, not only does it lower the amount that they're allowed to pollute, they're actually allowed to expand it. And new entrants are also allowed to come into the program. So we're looking at how new entrants are assessed and where they have to start. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done with that, and we are talking to all the major stakeholders on that to see what would be the most powerful amendments to that, what would make the biggest difference, and how it also works in with our national environmental laws, the EPBC Act, which will also be debated this year, and absolutely, as we saw last year, needs strengthening because the state of our environment is in a really bad way. So are there specific questions, Anyo, about that? And Georgia, would you like to add anything?
I think that's a really good introduction, Sophie. If people have more specific questions, then, it'll be interesting to hear what they are.
Really, I think you've covered it off. The questions, some of them were sort of angled around, given the Greens and Labor positioning, that they're concerned that the Greens may derail some progress, that sort of thing.
I can speak to that. I think, there is a big issue around the integrity of the carbon credit scheme that underpins the safeguard mechanism. We need to absolutely make sure that there is integrity in that Australian carbon credit units system. And one of the things that Georgia and I are looking at, because we're looking this term and probably continuing on into the future, we're going to continue to focus on integrity. And in this, one of the amendments that we want to bring in, and we think would be really powerful, was to mandate reporting of companies so that they do have to report not only what percentage they're using to offset, so what's their level of genuine abatement, genuine emissions cuts, what level are they using safeguard mechanism credits, which are, when those companies do actually reduce their emissions below their baseline, and what level is the ACC, what they're calling the ACCUs, the Australian Carbon Credit Offsets, which can be created through things like that avoided deforestation or human-induced regeneration. And a lot of those have been questioned, the integrity of those, that some of those have lower integrity. So if there's far greater transparency around what type of offsets companies are using, how much they're actually genuinely abating, it's really important. So what the amendment we'd like to see is mandatory reporting around that and far greater transparency and using data that is usable to the public, because at the moment it's very hard for even the specialists to analyse that data. So that's something we're looking at. Georgia, do you have anything to add on that note?
Yeah, I think the question about the Greens discussion with Labor in the upper house is a really interesting one. It's obviously one that we're watching very, very closely. The Greens have obviously taken the position that there should be no new coal or gas, full stop, as a precondition of their support of the bill. We watch that as closely as everybody else is. And we also have the view that coal and gas exploration, mining, burning, exporting needs to stop. We've been exploring how to incorporate that into amendments to the safeguard mechanism, and they are all still on the table for us. There's a need, obviously, over the next couple of weeks to be quite strategic about which amendments we pursue in light of what the Greens are doing. And so that is going to be a fascinating negotiation over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, integrity amendments to the safeguard mechanism are really simple. It's going to be hard for Labor to explain why they don't want to require companies to report on their levels of pollution and their levels of abatement, and the extent to which they're using ACCUs and which ACCUs and which whether they're using safeguard mechanism credits, because data is the basis of everything. As we know, we can't improve unless we can measure. So it's a really fascinating piece of legislation. There's a lot of ways that it can be improved, and we really see that as our role. Take the climate policy that the government's putting forward and just push them further on it, make them do better.
Exactly. And the powerful thing about increasing that transparency is public and investor pressure is huge. So it will really open up what companies are doing and where investors want to put their money. So it's a really powerful way to get change going into the future. But we are also looking at the actual framework in itself and how it will work and how it ties into the Environmental Act. And one thing we are specifically think that we will probably focus on is how new entrants, so new fossil fuel and coal projects, because the government is hell-bent on approving new projects, how they will be treated and how they will be assessed, and also how expansion of coal and gas is assessed as well. Will that need to come into, will international best practice have to apply to those as well? So there is a lot of space for improvement, and actually we need people like the Greens raising these issues. There's so much that needs to be done to strengthen that safeguard mechanism. And I think the government's aware of that, but it's always a negotiation, all these types of things. So we'll have our say in it, and we'll be introducing amendments so that we get in and we're a big part of those negotiations. And we're also working across, with the Senate. So David Pocock and some of those other crossbenchers have a huge role to play, because actually they're going to need to get their vote as well. It's not just the Greens. They'll also need to get David Pocock and others on board. And so it's good that you also have that kind of I'm not saying the Greens are not constructive, but that constructive, sensible centre, knowing that we need to move ahead, we need to get going, but we also need to push the government to do a lot more than what they're currently doing, and that's just a reality. Yeah, so I should say as well, Wednesday I'm heading up to Narrabri, to the Liverpool Plains to see what's on the cards up there with Santos and the coal seam gas fracking. So I'm going with Kylie Tink up there to get a really good insight as to what is about to happen there, and hearing from the farmers as well. I think there's a lot of farmers up there who just feel that they have been completely ignored, and we feel like it's really important, because we're talking about PEP 11, and of course you know that I seconded Zali Steggall's end PEP 11 bill during last Parliament, but it's, we don't only want to stop it here in our backyard. Of course we want to stop it here, but the International Energy Agency and the IPCC, there's a consensus, a worldwide consensus, that there needs to be no new oil or gas if we are to keep global temperature rise, probably actually to less than 2 degrees. And that's just a statement of fact. So looking at how we can bring the assessment of new fossil fuel projects under a lens that includes how much carbon emissions are they going to release. So that's where the environmental laws come in. So it's actually an immense year. It is a huge year. It's almost very hard to get your head around, but we're excited, and so is the rest of the crossbench. Will be a major part of those debates in pushing the government to do more and to get real action on climate change. I'll throw to you, Georgia.
Oh, sorry.
You can ask another question too.
Elaborate more on that, but and please do. I'll just say that once you have, we might go back to just giving the update and then do the questions at the end.
Yeah, I'm off on the update. And I don't mind if you throw me off. Yeah, so I did just mention I seconded Zali's end PEP 11. I think it's an incredibly clever piece of legislation because the government's actually in a bind at the moment, because PEP 11 has sort of re-emerged because the court found that there was what they call apprehended bias. So what they felt was that Scott Morrison putting himself into that resources ministry was just, he came up with a biased result. And so the court found that that was the case. So the process has to restart. Unfortunately, the government's trying not to comment now, but they've commented very clearly in the past. The Prime Minister has said, there will be no PEP 11, no ifs and buts, exclamation mark, it's stopped. And so have a lot of their ministers, including the Resources Minister. So as Ali sort of identified, there's always going to be the risk that these companies will take the government and try and get another finding of apprehended bias. And so what Zali is doing, she's just saying, well, let's introduce this piece of legislation that basically cancels the permit once and for all permanently. It doesn't exist. You bypass all that trouble, because we're not going to come to a conclusion the long way around otherwise. And so the government's not going to currently debate Zali's bill, but we'll keep pushing on that as well. I think we'll move on to another big piece of legislation, or a private member's bill, that I'll be bringing in later on in the year, is the greater regulations around junk food marketing and advertising. And we held what was a really successful roundtable with health experts from across the field. It was incredible. They're very excited because this issue of people being above the healthy weight range has been around for decades, and there's just been no movement on it. It's almost like it's too vexed, it's too complicated for either of the major parties to actually get movement on, because there's always backlash from the advertising industry, the marketing industry, and also the different food companies as well. But really there is, so this is why it's great to have an independent voice. I'm not funded by any of those groups, and I feel that our community strongly supports this. There is polling to show that 7 out of 10 people support greater regulation of junk food marketing to our children. So there's a lot of support for it. And we're really pushing ahead with that as well, bringing that private members bill together, and we'll introduce that later on in the year as well. I'm always looking at you, Georgia, to see whether you'd like to add anything in there.
Yeah, the panel session, the roundtable that we had, was absolutely fantastic. We got so many people together who've been working on these issues for so long, and we're really expecting there to be a variety, and sometimes even maybe even a divergence of views on what they thought the priorities were for Sophie's private members bill. Delightfully, everyone was very much in agreement on what needs to be done, and extremely supportive of what Sophie has already outlined. So now it's just a matter of getting the work done.
So we had, in conjunction with the policy, the Obesity Policy Coalition, we had a discussion paper, and really these groups, these expert groups, had put in their submissions as to what sort of suggestions they had. So it really is trying to build a strong coalition behind this. So there's so many different groups that have been working on obesity prevention for decades. So it's making sure that all these really important voices are heard. And I'm not just a Johnny-come-lately blow-in. And really listening to the expert evidence and the science. And it was a really powerful discussion, and we know where we're heading. And we had policy experts from the College of Physicians, the College of GPs. We had the Public Health Association for Australia. We had, as I said before, the Obesity Policy Coalition. We had Dietitians Australia. Who else did we have, Georgia?
We had academics from the University of Western Australia, from Deakin University.
And social media. Yeah. And also social media expert marketing on social media and digital platforms. So just to find out exactly what was possible and what was not possible. And it seems like there is a lot of possibilities on how we can regulate junk food marketing on social media platforms as well in the UK. So this is actually very similar to legislation that's actually been introduced in the UK. They're going to introduce it next year. But what they've done in the UK is they have banned junk food advertising on TV until 9 p.m. at night, from about 6:30 in the morning to 9 p.m. at night, because we know that children don't only watch children's shows, they sit with their families and watch family shows like, what are they? The Greatest, what's the cook-off? I've never watched them.
Australian Idol. Is that still around?
Australian Idol and all those cooking shows and sports shows and all that type of thing. And I should say, every time I talk about regulating junk food advertising, it is very clear that people want there to be far greater regulation around gambling advertising as well, and marketing. And that is something that both Zoe Daniel and Kate Cheney will be working on this year as well. So it's just great that, you know, you can have some, because we can't cover off everything, as I said, but we have different people on the crossbench leading on different things, and of course we support and debate, and so it's a really great way to collaborate with the others. So I think that'll probably come in around the middle of the year. As we said, sort of coming up. Yeah, sorry, Anu.
There was a specific question on this one. What's the response of the Department of Health to your bill?
Look, interesting. We haven't spoken directly to the Department of Health, but they have made recommendations about this type of thing for decades. And there is the National Preventive Health Strategy, and there's also the National Obesity Strategy, which has all these guidelines in it. They've been recommended for decades. I actually worked in health promotion back in 2010 on an obesity prevention project. And back then, you know, everyone was tearing their hair out already that there just wasn't any sort of real action on prevention. And we just were getting nowhere, which is why all these academics and experts have just jumped on it, and they're so excited. So we are building, and when we introduce that bill as well, what we're also doing is building a coalition of voices around it. So it won't just be policy experts. We'll be talking to mothers, we'll be having their voices, we'll be talking to dietitians, nutritionists, everyone, you know, everyone who's affected by it, so that we have a wide range of voices in the media. And again, it's about stimulating that national conversation. You know, how should we be caring for our children? What type of environment are we creating for our children? And I think, you know, that argument that it's individual responsibility, I just hope we will be able to let that one die, because when you have 2/3 of the adult population in the unhealthy weight range, and this massive growth of chronic disease, we know it's not an individual problem, it's a societal problem, and it absolutely needs a societal response. And we also are aware that just doing this with the marketing, trying to regulate marketing to children, it's again just one prong of what needs to be a multifaceted approach. As you know, what will happen with, you know, the tobacco and the smoking industry. And I might segue from there into smoking and vaping, because I also seconded, when I was down there, I seconded Kate Cheney introduced a motion for the government to introduce greater regulation around vaping, because we know that a lot of the big tobacco companies have actually bought out the e-cigarette companies and are now promoting vaping to our children, and they're doing that through the lolly flavors, through the colorful packaging. They're doing it through where the stores are located and the ease of actually accessing it. It's so accessible, it's ridiculous. You know, you've got children saying that they're so easy to access, it's not a problem at all. So I did a couple of speeches. I supported Kate Cheney's motion. I did another speech as well about vaping and the dangers of vaping, and how it is actually, rather than being used as a tool so much by GPs to help people get off nicotine and cigarettes, it's actually looking to be a gateway drug. So they know the biggest risk factor for smoking is use of e-cigarettes. And so by targeting our children, the other really, I think, horrific thing is that a lot of these products come in illegally. They're not properly regulated, and it might have on the packaging no nicotine, but we know that huge percentage of those contain nicotine, and nicotine is one of the absolutely most addictive drugs that exists, up there with cocaine and other things. So it is horrific, and by getting our children addicted to e-cigarettes, it's then an easy slide down to cigarette smoking. So it's a very cynical approach, and one that needs that whole loophole needs to be closed. And actually, the government's really keen to act on that as well. I think everyone is. But we'll keep pushing. It's a big issue, and we will keep pushing, because the tobacco industry is very powerful. They are still powerful, and they've seen another little opening for them, and they're off.
Yeah, it's a really it's another really interesting example as well of the important role that independents play, even when Labor has a majority government. So there are some issues that, for whatever reason, have been too difficult for either of the major parties to touch. It might be because they don't want to upset donors. It might be because it's unpopular in regional areas where, you know, they have slim margins. There can be a number of reasons. And so sometimes these things get to an impasse, and independents can stand up and say, well, hang on a minute, this makes a lot of sense. Let's do it.
And I just, again, I'm using all sorts of segues tonight, but Georgia just mentioned donors. And we saw when we were in the last week of Parliament that the Communications Minister had been accepting, Michelle Rowland had been accepting donations, $19,000 from gambling companies, and also had received a number of gifts from the gambling industry as well. And the issue is that she's there's an inquiry that she's heading up that's currently looking into gambling regulation, and that's part of her portfolio. She's a minister of regulating gambling. So there's a huge conflict of interest, and there was deathly silence from both the major parties. It was the crossbench that kept raising the issue and was again putting the spotlight on the issue. So it was really good. It was really good. Kate Chaney had a question after it came up, and she asked a really powerful question in question time, which is really important, because question time, although it is a bit of theatre, it does get a lot of media attention. So we just need to keep our focus on these things. And that is coming back to what is the role of an independent, and it is holding the government to account, you know, and pushing the government to do more sometimes, but that is a fundamental role, holding the government to account, particularly on this. They were so supportive of her, they just dismissed it out of hand. Yeah, so that was interesting. I'll also just say I appeared on a panel when I was down there for the Australia Institute on integrity of the carbon market. So that was good to speak on that, and just how it was going to impact our Pacific neighbours. I think a lot of you probably know I spent quite a bit of time in PNG, sort of just before Christmas and just after, on two different delegations, weirdly. And one was specifically on health, and climate change is going to impact the health of that nation. They are one of the most vulnerable nations in the world, and climate change will have a terrible impact on them. Already they're struggling, but it will, if we have increased severe weather events, then it's going to impact their security of their housing and their food, and there'll be climate refugees. And already people from one of the islands in Bougainville have had to relocate from their island home. So it's already happening. It's already kicking in. I was also very pleased to co-chair our very first Parliamentary Friends of Future Generations group. It was fascinating. Unfortunately, I had to go off and vote a number of times, but this Parliamentary Friends of Future Generations is really, I think, going to be powerful, because we're looking at how we can move away from short-term decision-making and move that to long-term, and how we bring that intergenerational lens into that decision-making, how we bring young people's voices and young people's needs into that. Because as I was saying, we should be sort of making these decisions based not only on what's best for us now, but on what's good, you know, what's in the best interest of our of future generations as well, people who aren't alive. We have to keep that in mind. There's a lot. So some of the biggest issues that we'll be looking at are things like, of course, climate change. That's going to, and also biosecurity into the future, and artificial intelligence. How are these types of, they're huge issues, how they're going to impact future generations. and things like biological warfare as well. So just starting to think about these things and start planning for these things. We need long-term plans. We don't want to just be caught out at the last second and, you know, too late. So that is a fantastic group to be a part of. There's a lot of different groups working on that as well. So I think it will generate some really interesting conversations and ideas as well.
Yeah, it's quite a sophisticated concept what this group's trying to put forward, and it's really that future generations should be a key criteria in the decisions that government makes about what their priorities are, and it should be considered as a factor in all legislation. How is it going to impact future generations? So it's absolutely necessary, and it makes sense. I mean, if we'd been considering future generations for the last 50 years, we might be in a different place to where we are now. So it's a great group.
Yeah, and there's the group. So often when you have these parliamentary friends of groups, and I've got to say there's thousands, but maybe not thousands, but there is a lot of them. So you usually sort of partner with a particular group, and the group that we're partnering is Foundations for Future, and they are these, you know, great, driven, committed young people who are all very committed to this cause and looking to international examples of how other countries, particularly Wales, because Wales is a bit of a gold standard as to how you bring this intergenerational lens into decision making, policy making. So it's very, very interested, and I look forward as well to how we can start implementing similar things in the way we make decisions here in Australia. Yeah, so if anyone's interested in that, look to Wales. Check it out. I'll just quickly.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
You're right.
I was going to say, I see that you received 9 ministerial briefings on legislation. What does that mean? What happens in a ministerial briefing?
So look, actually the government is trying to collaborate with the crossbench. They are trying to communicate with the crossbench, because a lot of the time things move really quickly, and we sometimes might not hear that a piece of legislation has been introduced until the night before. So it's really hard to scramble, particularly when you only have one personal staff, Georgia, trying to cover off on all these issues and do it last minute. So when we're down in Canberra, there really isn't a second to stop and take a breath, is there? We're going from the crack of dawn, you know, often if we're not just preparing speeches or responses or checking out amendments and trying to get our heads around them, we are going, there's usually breakfast. So during the last sitting, there was the International Women's Day breakfast. I'm sure that there was lots of others, but there's always something on, and you're going through into the evening as well. And part of it is receiving briefings. So you receive briefings not only from major stakeholder groups, we also receive ministerial briefings. And so what the Labor government has done, they've given us an hour each week that we're in Parliament, where the ministers can come in and spend a little bit of time. If they can't make it, then their chief of staff comes in to brief the crossbench on what is coming up for them, and to not only do that, but just to allow us to ask questions. So it means that we understand what they're doing. We understand what their reasoning is behind it, and we get the opportunity to ask questions and suggest amendments. And it doesn't mean that we vote for it, but it just allows us to have that understanding so we can make a much better decision on things. It's been really amazing, actually.
Yeah, I think it's probably the most important hour of the week, if I'm honest. Seeing the ministers lining up outside the door, waiting for their 10-15 minutes to come in and brief the formidable crossbench, who pepper them with questions about every single piece of legislation. It's quite a sight.
Yeah, so it'll be things on, you know, and we did have a number of meetings as well. It depends. We will also have individual meetings with individual ministers as well if they've got a big piece of legislation coming up. So we had a couple of meetings with Andrew Giles, who's the Immigration Minister, talking about abolishing the temporary protection visas and chefs as well, and who that would benefit and who it would impact. And also, you know, there's some bits of, you know, we weren't happy about one of, they did that at the same time. We were very happy about that, but they also did a different amendment to something we weren't terribly happy about.
But during the what the upshot of that was that during the 2-week sitting period, because immigration was on the agenda, I think we actually had 3 briefings from Minister Giles alone, because the crossbench independents, particularly the community independents, were jumping up and down about it so much. So, you know, that's an indication also of how the government does listen to the independents and give them an opportunity to express their concerns and to have their questions answered. It's terrific.
And there's been a lot of pressure from ever since, since May last year when we were elected. There's been a lot of pressure on the government to hold true to their promise to abolish those TPVs and the Chevs as well. So safe haven visas and temporary protection visas have been abolished for people who arrived before the whole stopping the boats thing, the date of the stopping the boats. It doesn't actually apply to people who arrived after that date, which is the next area to push for change. That we also received briefings from the Attorney General on different things on the Family Law Act, very interesting. That just helps us to understand where we're coming from. I should say another thing that we focused on last week quite a lot was the National Reconstruction Fund. That's a huge piece of legislation, because we keep hearing, I talk about it, everyone talks about, we have the potential here in Australia to become a renewable energy superpower, to start manufacturing again and value adding. And this is actually a way to start that investment in innovation and enterprise and start that value adding and restart manufacturing in this country. So it is an incredible, I think, opportunity for this country to turn away, like, as I said, to shift from the whole dig it and ship it mentality, from the lucky country to the clever country. And that is how even the Business Council of Australia has talked about how we need to diversify our economy, we need to future-proof it, we need to move into those high-tech clean energy sectors, because that is the only way we're going to be able to maintain our current standard of living, because they're high-wage, well-paid jobs. There'll be a huge range of jobs across the country, not just in the cities, but regionally as well. So it is an exciting opportunity, but we did have a concern around it because, again, it comes down to the integrity of the board appointments. So, so I introduced an amendment where, again, using the framework of my Ending Jobs for Mates bill, at the moment, there's a board that will get selected by the minister, or ministers, I should say, because there's 2 ministers in charge, the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Industry and Science. It will be entirely up to their discretion who is on this board. And this board is responsible for the dispersion of $15 billion. So we want to make sure that we can trust the decisions that are being made by this board, and also that it's not being sort of siphoned off into cronies. I'm not saying that the government will do it, but people need to have that, be able to trust in those decisions that are being made, so there's not that potential for corruption of that process. So
the way that the bill's structured at the moment, the government have simply said that the appointments are at the sole discretion of the ministers, as Sophie said. And one provision that they've thrown in there for good measure is that there has to be a level of expertise and experience to the members that are appointed to the board. But we say, and they throw that around in the literature as proof that the board will be independent. Now, of course, that's not proof of independence at all. It's just proof that these people might have experience in a particular area. So we say, just because you say it's independent doesn't mean it is. And we're going to try and fix that up.
As George said, you might have the expertise, but you might still holiday with the minister.
Yeah.
Be influenced by them.
There's been a question that about $4 billion out of the fund being used for EV battery renewable tech. Is that correct? It's $3 billion. So there have been a few commitments made so far. One of them, the biggest, was for $3 billion for basically the renewables industry, if we want to call it that very broadly. So that's really pleasing.
Now, when Georgia started, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, was it 1.5 billion that's been labelled for medical devices?
Either 1.5 or 1.
Yeah, so that's really good for our electorate as well, because we've got a lot of sort of small, medium medical equipment, medical device manufacturers in this area. So it's really good. And the other thing we said is we were really caught out during COVID. We really found out where our vulnerabilities were, and a lot of it was around medical manufacturing. So that is one of the 7 priority areas. So that'll be great. And actually, I should say one really exciting thing, because we met with Minister Husick about this, just to talk to him about our concerns about the integrity of the board, but also just to find out more about it and to tell him as well about the different innovators we have in our electorate. And he has agreed to come up and do a tour around different, like different places, just to see what they're doing and to hold a bit of a round table as well to hear from people in our electorate. So that's very exciting.
It's very exciting. And I'm just conscious, guys, I'm just looking at the time. We did say at the beginning we weren't sure if we'd last a full hour, but we're going to struggle actually. And Sophie was right. She said, we've done so much in the past 2 weeks. I don't know how we'll ever fit it into 1 hour. And I think you were right. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. So we haven't talked so far about the speeches. Some of them have been mentioned, but the speeches that Sophie made on national cultural policy, vaping, integrity of the NRF board and PEP 11. She voted in support of social and affordable housing and voted in support of permanent visas for TPV and SHEV holders. She also met with several Indigenous leaders to discuss the voice and attended a working group briefing by Minister Linda Burney, which I'm sure everybody is incredibly interested in. There's a question specific, also made budget submissions, which is a huge job. There's a question specifically in the chat with something we were going to talk about, which is to do with Behrooz Boochani. So I don't know if you want to talk about your meeting there.
Behrooz Boochani was there, and it coincides. He was there. He's released a new book, but also because the government was about to introduce or abolish the temporary protection visas and the safe haven visas, so that people could become permanent residents, because being on those temporary visas meant that they didn't have access to all the social services that we have. They didn't have access to Medicare. They couldn't study. They couldn't get loans for their businesses. I mean, it was just, they were just in limbo. And also the other big thing was they couldn't leave the country and then to visit relatives in another country and then come back. So really it has made a huge difference to a lot of those people, 19,000 people or more who were on those visas before a particular date.
Do a few more so that we don't run out of time to do a few questions. Is that okay? Or did you want to? Yep. So one person asked what your connection with the senators is like.
Well, the best connection, as I said, we did a briefing recently to let them know as well about the integrity private members bill I'm bringing in. So we need to let them know so that they know that it's coming. So, and we also have, because usually what happens is we're down in Canberra for 2 weeks at a time. So what will happen is get down there on a Sunday night. Parliament sits from Monday to Thursday, usually back in the electorate by Thursday night, and then back down again on the Sunday night. So there's 2 weeks. So one of those weeks, we will do a combined crossbench meeting with both Senate crossbench and House of Reps crossbench, just so that we are communicating and we're aware of what's happening, because quite often it's powerful to know what's going on in both. But like if you didn't go out of your way to meet senators and talk to senators, you would never see them. We don't cross paths. We're in other sides of the building. And actually that was why it was really good to go to Papua New Guinea, because I got to meet, other senators. It was really good and hear about their role and what they're up to.
And there's a specific question here too. Can you work with Senator Pocock to end native forest logging?
Yes. Yes, working with him.
Yes.
But Dave, look, luckily, Dave is absolutely fantastic. We had a meeting with him the other day. He always comes to our meetings, but he's also very, very busy. But very, very keen to work together. And we know it'll be a lot more powerful when we're supporting what he's trying to do and he's supporting what we're trying to do. So quite often we know we don't have the numbers in the lower house to get the amendments through that we want to. And the government will say that they'll only negotiate that, or they'll only debate that in the Senate. But it's really important that we are raising the issues in the House of Reps and having a big time strong debate on it as well, and supporting what's happening in the Senate. It's all about, again, I keep saying it's all about bringing awareness to these issues and putting the pressure on constantly. And quite often, we can get the government to move in a certain direction, but it just supports what the Senate can do as well and the direction that they're heading in. So a lot of it is supporting David. David played in the Brumbies, same rugby team as my husband Adam, so we're quite good friends.
That's great. And so we also have a question: what's happening with the GPs, bulk billing rates, and GP shortages? Is the industry and government heading in the right direction?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question, and being a GP, I've got a big role to play in that part. I've been talking to quite a number of GPs about this. There is a lot of consensus that, obviously there just hasn't been the investment in primary healthcare that there needs to have been over, I'd say, decades. And so what it's meant is that prevention's not happening as much, the chronic care of, chronic medical conditions is not happening as well. And so people aren't able to get into their GP, or it's too expensive. So they end up in the public hospital system. The public hospital system is overrun. There's ambulances banking. There's not enough beds in the hospital. So the whole system is completely stretched. So unless we start looking at prevention and primary health care and really supporting that side of the equation, the whole system is at risk, really. And there's research that's been done in Norway. Norway, of course, being one of those socialist countries, they've put a lot of investment into prevention and primary healthcare, and they found that they've been able to actually close hospitals. So whereas in most parts of the world we're expanding that really expensive end of healthcare, they've been able to close hospitals. So it's quite powerful, but I do have a big role to play. I think that the government's hasn't gone far enough, not nearly far enough. I think they are making some good decisions around how we really utilise our allied health and how we can work together as a team, because I know in my practice we had a nurse there and she just wasn't being utilised to her full capacity. And if governments start to actually fund, because the government wasn't actually funding any work that they were doing. So it's limited what they were able to do. So working with the allied health is really powerful, but also at the same time recognising that we can't fracture patient care. There does need to be a role for somebody who's leading that care for the patient, and that role is for the GP. The GPs are generalists. They look at the patient as a whole, and just working with the different allied health on specific areas is a really powerful way to, I think, maximise what can happen in primary care. But I think when it comes down to it, there needs to be more investment as well in Medicare rebates, because part of the problem is general practice is a highly feminised workforce. And again, like most feminized workforces, they're underpaid and overworked. So people work a lot of hours of unpaid work. And what's happening is these junior doctors are making the decision to go into other specialties other than general practice, because it is hard. Like GPs are finding it hard to keep their doors open. And I even heard it's a really sad story that there's been one GP, a particular main GP up in Alice Springs, and he's so burnt out. He's been there for, 47 years or something. And he's feeling like he needs to shut his doors, and he's the main carer up there. He can't go on, and they're not able to get somebody to refill that position.
It's horrible. We're actually starting to run out of time. You did actually cover off, we won't be able to get to every single question, but you did mention some things that were asked in the Q&A, which includes it appears that Mark Butler is contemplating major update of Medicare. Is the government talking to the independents on this? And the other thing that you mentioned that is in another question was, there are a few questions about different sort of approaches to tax, including a Norway-style Australian Future Fund, which would be much more progressive, and you have also mentioned that. I don't know if you want to sort of respond to the Mark Butler, but we will have to maybe hold off on the rest of the questions.
The government doesn't really, I would make, if I want to meet with Mark Butler, I'll have to make that appointment. If you know what I mean, I'll have to make that decision. But also working with Jed Kearney, who's the Assistant Health Minister. She's also very good, and particularly on primary health care, and just organising a meeting with her coming up, because just talking about the GPs have a huge role to play in mental health, in patients' mental health care. It happens almost, in so many of the appointments, whether it's a mental health care appointment or not. It's always checking in. What was the other question, Anya?
Oh, it wasn't so much a question, just acknowledging that you did sort of talk about the Norwegian style future fund.
Oh,
yeah, and I think that, so really there are a few questions that we didn't quite make it to answer, but what I would do is I would encourage everybody to remember those questions and come along. Marie Nutt put it in the chat just now. The Voices of Mackellar are hosting a town hall very soon, in a couple of weeks now. Well, actually only 8 days now. And you should please register for the town hall, where Sophie will be answering a Q&A just like tonight. But if we didn't get to your question, please bring it along to the Q&A and ask again. And I'm sure we all feel, we apologize if we didn't get to all of the questions. They're all fantastic questions, and we'll do our best to respond to them in other ways. But certainly if we see you at the Voices of Mackellar Town Hall. Thank you both, Sophie and Georgia, for the incredible job that you're doing both here in the community and down in Canberra. We will do this again. Sophie and Georgia will be in Canberra for almost the whole of March. They've got 3 weeks out of 4 down there in March. So we'll aim to update you again after that. We kind of run into Easter around that time, so we'll find a good date. So yeah, the town hall is at DYRSL on the 28th of February. As Sophie mentioned, we're also in the process right now of printing the results of the big survey report. So that will be landing in all of your letterboxes in mid-March. We hope to see you at the town hall, if not before. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Georgia.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks, everyone.
And just before we close off, I should say we've only really talked about the parliamentary side of things, and obviously the community side and what the electoral office does here is massive. Just supporting the community here, and it would be good to have a session one time about what happens here in the office and how we're supporting the community locally as well. I keep saying that all these flowers and chocolates arrive to the office and they're never for me, they're all for everyone who's picking up the phone and helping people. So it's wonderful that there's these motivated and compassionate people on the phone for people to get help from. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Anya, for organising. Anya is our amazing community engagement person. It's such a vital role of what we do. And so glad you could join us. And sorry we didn't get through everything, but we look forward to chatting more in the future.
And please sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. And please tell everybody all of your neighbours and friends, that we don't automatically have their email addresses unless they've registered with us. So please go onto the website and register so everybody can hear the news. Have a great evening. Enjoy your dinner. Thanks for coming. Bye.